we're going to have a look at the state of the sector research from this year in comparison to the previous two reports, so we can understand a little bit about what's perhaps going on in the sector. I am going to throw a lot of numbers around, so apologies for that, but I am trying to tell the story of some of those numbers as we go along. There'll be a bit of an opportunity for questions and clarifications, all that sort of thing. I would urge you, though, to read the full report, or at least have a look through it, because there's a lot of rich stuff in there where we asked some questions this time around, you know, what's been the impact of things like Brexit or the Black Lives Matter movement that happened last year, all those sorts of contextual things that it's a bit hard to get across in full in, you know, a quick presentation. So there's a lot of rich stuff about the story of what's going on in our sector in the longer version of the report that we've got time to go into here. I'm just going to do the big numbers. So I'm just going to share my screen. If you want to turn your camera off during this bit, it's absolutely fine. I know sometimes people have connection problems when there's a screen share going on. So bear with me and hopefully this will work. So, right, now, can everybody see that? Can I get away? Grand, okay. So, yeah, state of the sector 2021. Which one's going to move it forward? As Helen said, this has been a piece of work that local infrastructure organisations across Greater Manchester have been doing for a number of years. So MAC first took part in 2012, published in 2013, then we did another one in 2017, and these are the partner organisations who took part this time round. So Action Together covering Rochdale, Tameside and Oldham, Bolton CVS, Bury Voluntary Community Faith Alliance, Salford CVS Sector 3, which is Stockport, and then Trafford Council and Wigan Council for those two areas. Academic partner this time was the University of Salford, who work with GMCVO, of course, and 10GM is the partnership of local infrastructure organisations set up by Salford, Action Together, Bolton and MAC, which we're working on. I'm sure you've heard me talk about that before. Those were the partners who did all the pulling together of the report. But actually the biggest, most important contribution was all of you responding to the survey. And I just want to say right here, thank you so much for everybody who took time out to respond to the survey, particularly in the middle of a global pandemic when all of us had tons of other things to do. It really, really is appreciated, and you will see how much it matters as we go on through these findings, that we actually take time to look at this stuff about our own organisation. So thank you to everybody who responded to the survey. The brilliant news is, and it's always important to remember this, there is such a good news story in all of this. There is a huge wealth of local, brilliant community organisations all across the city, and more people are getting involved in doing more things in Manchester, in all of our communities. And when we talk about some of these numbers, that's the bit that is really important to hold on to. It's such a powerful story, particularly if you've not heard some of this before. We're going to look at, because we all work in the voluntary sector, what's changed behind some of these numbers. But if you are, and we'll be sharing the slides from this afterwards, if you are presenting these statistics to anyone, if you're involved in any conversations or you want to quote from any of these, please do make the most of the fact that this is actually an incredibly positive story for Manchester and represents a huge shared success for all of us. So first off, and I would normally love to do this as a kind of play your cards right, higher and lower thing, but we haven't got time today. I'm going to try and get through these a bit quicker. How many organisations are there? The new number is 3,871. I am sure that number's changed already, because I know for a fact our capacity building teams helped set up some new organisations. But if you look at how that's been changing over the last few years, there's a steady growth, mostly in the small community organisations. I'm sure there's a bit of a bounce with things like austerity kicking in as people set up community organisations to tackle the impacts of all those sorts of things. Possibly we're just getting slightly better at counting them over time, but broadly around about the 3,000 to 4,000 mark in the city. And of course the population's been growing in that time as well, so more people coming in or more people being born here and wanting to set up things. So again, fantastic story of a thriving community sector. How does that break down? Well, no surprises here. The vast majority, at least 2/3 of those organisations, are tiny little community association type organisations who run on less than 10 grand a year. That's always been the case, as you can see, right back to 2013 and beyond. That's true of most parts of the country. The vast majority of our sector is small groups with some activity budgets, and they do amazing things and make stuff happen in their communities. In Manchester, we've got a fairly healthy size of small and medium-sized organisations. So these are probably the ones that employ some staff, deliver some services either under a grant or a contract agreement. And particularly when you look at the medium-sized ones, they're probably ones that are quite key in the community that they work with, whether that's a place or a community of identity, like a particular ethnic community. And those are quite crucial assets in those communities because they're often something that it's taken many years to build up. Within the micro organisations, there's usually a lot more churn because community groups tend to be set up around a few individuals, and then they change and evolve over time. Maybe one closes down and a new one takes its place. But these small and medium ones are kind of the ones that tend to be around a lot longer and have obviously more of the money going through them, but also more of the sector's paid workforce. And then you get into the larger organisations, over £1 million, some significant national names in there in terms of their footprint in Manchester, but also some of our sizable locally grown organisations like the George House Trust here today, LGBT Foundation, some big names, 42nd Street, another, those sorts of organisations. We have just focused on what their footprint is in Manchester, but many of those will be working across Greater Manchester as well. And this is another example where Manchester is quite different from the other boroughs as well, because we have a much bigger proportion of bigger organisations. Who do they work with? Some consistency in here and some good news. The broadening of the sector to become more generic, I think, is something we've all seen as funding pressures have bitten in. So 39% of organisations now say they work with everyone. There's a bit of a thing to explore there about whether that means they're becoming more inclusive or whether actually we're losing some of that specialism in the sector. But anyway, it's certainly something to be proud of, that we've got such a thriving sector and still keeping some of that diversity of our approach. So roughly consistent, 20 to 25% children and young people. Slightly worrying that there's been a drop because you would have expected that to be a growth area. I suspect some of what's going on there is the relationships with things like children's services are not as strong as they were in previous years. Something to understand. A big positive about the recovery of the older people sector. So it dropped down quite drastically in 2017 and has recovered a bit. I think some of that may be because of things like the Ambition for Ageing programme that GMCVO have run. Black, minority, ethnic community organisations recognise that's possibly a problematic and slightly catch-all term, which has a lot of complexity in it itself, but we seem to have arrested the potential for those organisations to be being lost, which is what was concerning me in the last report. So hopefully, as given the focus that there was last year and this year on investing into diverse communities across the city and thinking about how we tackle inequalities, hopefully we will see that number increase. And people with mental health needs is a fairly consistent picture. More to do there, of course. Main areas of work, no surprises that the catch-all term community development always comes out top. I think that's roughly fairly consistent, that just being in the community and doing stuff is perhaps a more obvious way of describing it. What's interesting to me is the focus on health and well-being. We've always talked about the fact that, in the last two reports, 44% suddenly drops to 26%. But if you look at some of the relationship issues later on, with the health organisations, I think there's something quite significant going on there about how the sector perceives its focus. I think I would put that alongside that massive increase in physical activity, sports and leisure groups. Maybe what's happened with things like GM Moving coming along is it's suddenly become okay to say that, no, our focus is on physical activity and sport and leisure, and not trying to pitch always to the health agenda, because GM Moving has created a space to do that. And it may be that we're just getting better at contacting those groups. I think the others, fairly consistent, a sad drop in terms of education and training. Again, I suspect that's a reflection of budgets, where the education and training budgets have gone in recent years, and obviously, you know, that's going to be an impact of Brexit as well. And economic well-being, sadly, a necessity that's on the rise, because that's basically poverty, isn't it? That's work on poverty. A dip in the arts, heritage and culture sector, which I think we need to understand a bit more what's going on there. It may be because of the city's strategy around developing large cultural bodies rather than investing in grassroots organisations. Don't know, something to explore. I'm going to move us on. This is my favourite statistic, if I'm perfectly honest. 162,278 volunteers in Manchester in our sector. There's more people out there volunteering in the public services, all those sorts of things, but this is just in our sector. And look at how that's grown over the years. You know, that has been something that we have been trying to do, and here is the impact of that happening. I'm going to do something I try to avoid doing too often, but I'm going to claim some credit for Mac in that. And in particular, my volunteer centre colleagues, because actually that represents the exact period really where our volunteer centre has been open. So I think if you want some proof, it's not exact causation, because we can't prove the exact link, but I am going to say that it can't be a coincidence that we've managed to grow volunteering by growing the profile of volunteering and providing spaces for Manchester people to get involved in it through our volunteer centre. So that's a fantastic result. And of course, it means more people are getting the benefits of volunteering. So the benefits to organisations, 480,000 hours per week of freely given effort, but also obviously there's benefits to the individuals through volunteering. So even though, if you look at those numbers and do the maths, the hours per head have reduced, so we've got more people involved, they are collectively giving more time, but on an individual basis, the number's going down slightly. I don't think that matters too much, because actually that's more people getting the benefits in terms of health, skills, social connection, all those things from volunteering. So still a fantastic story. Paid staff. Now, this is an interesting one. We now reckon there are 19,607 full-time equivalent paid staff in the sector in Manchester, and that's 32,246 people. Now, I suspect what's going on here when you look at the previous ones is we've probably undercounted in the past. I don't see that there has been that level of growth in our organisations. What's interesting, I think, is the increased part-timeness of our sector. That does seem to fit with what I've seen and we've seen at MAC over the years, which is people trying to make more jobs happen with less hours, simply because of the way funding's gone. So I would say that this is probably a more accurate figure than we've had before, but when you put the volunteering and paid staff together, you get this staggering figure of almost 200,000 people in our sector's workforce in the city, and that's amazing. That's something we'll come back to in the recommendations. But think about the population of Manchester itself is, heading for 600,000, and we've got 194,524 people involved in our sector in some capacity. That's a brilliant story. And a wonderful bit of news, 67% of Manchester VCSE organisations pay the real living wage. Well done to all of you who are paying the real living wage. I know not everybody's necessarily accredited, because that's kind of an extra cost, but that's certainly something we really want to try and drive up and see if we can get it nearer to 100. bearing in mind not all organisations employ staff, so that doesn't apply, but it's certainly an ambition for the city as a whole to make Manchester a real living wage place. Now, when I'm introducing this slide to public sector colleagues, I have to warn them that it's not a heart attack diagram or one of those monitors. This is what life in the VCSE sector feels like a lot of the time. This is how our income has fluctuated since sort of 2009. And it just shows you what's been going on with the sector's finances and how hard we have to work to make stuff happen. You can see the impact. The first big dip is the impact of what was then known as the credit crunch, the impact that there was in terms of the bringing in of austerity in 2010-11. And there was a recovery in the sector because funders like lottery and everybody suddenly started putting together transition funds and emergency programs. They wound down a bit. There was a bit of a slight recovery and then a massive drop again, as I think it's noticeable. You know, there was a change in the leadership of the government. There wasn't a change of government because it's the same party, but we started to see further measures being put in. Then you've got Brexit and all those things. There's been some recovery in recent years, but I think some of that is down to our efforts as a sector, which I'll come on to in a minute. What it does show is just that the level of complexity that there has to be in order to keep losing and rebuilding, that represents a huge amount of work, and sadly, the overall trend is downwards. That's a structural issue for us as a sector. Where the money comes from. A very positive thing in that lots of organisations, a growing number of organisations are getting funds through the City Council, but look at that for the NHS. They've dropped off the scale, and that's after we've previously raised with them that there is a disproportionate part of our sector that's focused on health and wellbeing compared to the organisations that actually receive support from health services. Now, some of that may be because there's been, there's Manchester Health and Care Commissioning, and that may be perceived as being partly the council rather than just the NHS. So there's a bit to understand behind this, but it does raise a challenge for me about what our sector's relationship is with health bodies in the city, particularly as they are all about to change again. Some mixed news around the non-public sector sources. So fundraising, we all know, has taken a hit ever since March last year, when so many activities that people did for fundraising became difficult, and that's a pattern reflected across the country. We know that there have been difficulties with grants from trusts and foundations because competition has been so big, and they have mostly scaled their grants programs down to COVID response work over the last year. So I suspect something of that impact is happening. Lots and lots of mini grants, but not so many of the big chunky grants you can use to develop multi-year programs. Obviously, charging for goods and services has been problematic as people have delivered more stuff online, and traditional models of generating income through charging suddenly stopped working when we went into lockdown. Lottery one, I think that's possibly a bit of a readjustment that we're getting. I think it was described to me as perhaps we'd done too well in getting lottery money into Manchester. I don't see that as a problem, but perhaps there's a bit of rebalancing going on about the amount of lottery money that Manchester has started to attract compared to what it had been doing, sort of 10 years ago when we were frankly missing out on our fair share. So maybe that's not such a bad story, but it does again show that the success that we were building up in 2017 is facing some challenges now because the environment that we work in has changed so rapidly. And here's the impact of that: the levels of our reserves. I will often say to people, the sector is burning through its reserves, literally and metaphorically. We are all working flat out to provide support to our communities, all of that stuff. And you can see how that's also reflected in the way our organisations are financed. So the figures in red are the latest ones, and the other figures are from the 2017 report. What it shows is that there is still a trend of organisations spending more than they are bringing in and being less able to top up their reserves. So in other words, our sector's resilience is under threat because we are having to respond to crises. And that reserves money, remember, well, you will all know this as organisations, once that reserves money is spent, it is very, very hard to replenish it. You know, you look at the numbers of organisations that manage to increase their reserves, 17%. It's getting harder and harder to build up those reserves. And that has a knock-on effect because in terms of taking risk, in terms of, you know, covering those gaps between different grant programmes, all the things that we use reserves for, as well as propping up services, that becomes less and less possible over time. And that's a big concern that we need to make funders and commissioners aware of the importance of allowing us as organisations to have a good, healthy level of reserves. Some good news about relationships. Good showing from the City Council there. 87% fairly consistent, again, reflected in a healthy funding relationship. But look at that again with the NHS, a massive dropping off of that relationship as perceived by the sector. Private sector relationships, again, fairly consistent. I think what's interesting is when you look at the full report, there's maybe some questioning over how positively beneficial those private sector relationships are generally, but maybe one of the legacies of COVID and lockdown is that there's been more practical, let's just get on with it, partnerships between the private sector and the VCSE sector. Who knows? Brilliant story about the interconnectedness of our sector. Look at that, 90% of organisations in Manchester work with other VCSE organisations. That is so, so good and shows a really strong, healthy, vibrant sector. I mean, 92, 94 is all roughly the same. And also for the first time showing a high level of connectivity, because we've never measured this before, with other parts of Greater Manchester. So again, in the whole of that, you know, let's not worry too much about communities and boundaries and all those things. A brilliant story of a very, very agile, connected sector that's working flat out to make stuff happen in communities. So the recommendations. These recommendations were put together by all the partners, and they are really aimed at the public sector because that's who we want to have a conversation with most in terms of thinking about our role in places. There is some message for the private sector and there's also some reflection for us in this as well. Sector should be a strategic partner in all recovery plans. So as we move on from COVID, we need to be involved in those discussions. We are a part of the local economy. Look at how many people we employ. Look at how much money we bring in to the area. We're an income generator, an employer, and we have led in responding to the crises that have hit our communities in the last 2 years, whether that's COVID or storms, and who knows, looks like we might be heading for another crisis in terms of the weather, or as some of the organisations on this call are currently doing, supporting the arrivals from Afghanistan. We are always part of that ecosystem of response, but it's not acknowledged enough. And I think that's something we can certainly build on from the last year. Again, commissioning, it's been a recurring theme for us for many years, but thinking about, like I said, reserves, how you enable organisations to grow and innovate and build that inclusive economy. Thinking about how we respond to inequalities, so the Greater Manchester Independent Inequalities Commission. If you've not read the report, I would urge you to do so. It's a really powerful statement of some of the things that are happening in Greater Manchester. And the focus on co-design. So one of MAC's founding principles, the people who are affected by decisions should be involved in taking those decisions, whether that's about service design or indeed any other kinds of decisions about what's going on in their community. That is a way to tackle inequalities. It's not recognised enough. Focus on building the relationships with private businesses. Some really good examples and a lot to learn from as we move out of COVID. And then something I've been banging on about for a very long time now, thinking about the voluntary sector workforce. So we've all seen and we've all experienced how hard our sector has worked, our people have worked during COVID, and that we actually don't get that much support in terms of our workforce, looking after our well-being, developing new talent, bringing in more people who maybe didn't start to think of the sector. So it's not just living wage, it's also about investing in our people, growing that new workforce for the future. So interested in talking to people about that. So in summary, again, loads and loads of positives. Brilliant organisations, growing, doing amazing things, but working harder and harder to keep up services and activities, using up their reserves, as I said. It's enterprising. You think about the amount of work that there is to pull in income and resources and people from all of those different strands that we've looked at. This is a hugely entrepreneurial sector and we don't get enough credit for that. And responding to those demands that are on us, whether that's the response to COVID, the economic well-being, the poverty issues that we've seen growing in our city, health and well-being challenges in our city. We are constantly limited by our funding priorities in terms of, by other people's funding priorities in terms of what we can do. I think we've got to help build the case to show that investing in the VCSE sector is a way to change some of those things and to create more positive outcomes. There are the links to the reports online. There's also a video on the GM one where we launched it a couple of months ago. If you want to see any of it in action, I'd urge you to have a look at our YouTube channel, and obviously the Manchester Community Central website has all the resources for your support needs as organisations in Manchester. But yeah, do please have a look at the full report. We'll share these slides so that you can use them anywhere, anytime you've got an opportunity to present to public sector partners, private sector partners, funders, whoever. This is a resource for all of us.